Welcome and thank you for tuning in. We're going forward with our healing workshop addressing maladjusted coping modes. And in this section of the workshop, we are going to review groups of maladjusted, potentially maladjusted modalities of coping. These maladjusted coping modalities attached to the schemas of our emotional wounds. In other words, if we have an experience of, for example, emotional deprivation, we can get, for example, an entitlement coping mode that perpetuates the idea that we are deprived emotionally. In other words, if I get the emotional support I want, I'll be okay. But this policy produces a repetitive fixation, and it ironically traps us in the schema of our emotional wound, and we do not move along. So maladjusted coping modes are important to identify why they can be interrupted, and we can then liberate the emotional wound from this perpetuating complex. And that's what it would be. It's a complex. The schema of the emotional wound and the maladjusted coping mode, for example, providing a defense, ultimately perpetuates the circumstance, does not allow it to process. Get that idea? So coping modes, we can categorize them to some extent. Many of them are overcompensations. In other words, if you have a sense of defectiveness, say, for example, you have the defectiveness schema in an acute phase. Well, the defectiveness schema can have, for example, seeking approval as a means, a pseudotherapy, an overcompensation that leaves us fixated on that emotional wound, on that mode state. In other words, the complex generates a perspective, and we begin to live through it unawareingly. We are unaware. It is possessing us. And of course, meditation provides that wonderful psychological distance that gives us the opportunity to ID a maladjusted coping mode and interrupt it. The other type of coping mode is the avoidant type. These are, for example, the anesthetizing, burying thoughts, being distracted, and evading our concerns. And that too produces a fixation. Though it's very subtle, it can be subtle, it still produces an intrusive symptom. In other words, the schema is empowered by the maladjusted coping mode. It is then able to intrude into our affairs, influencing issues of health, instances of disappointment. Okay, so let's talk about maladjusted coping modes. Let's take our first group today. And we're going to look at being judgmental, a very important one. Now, there are associated schemas or coping modes. Of course, all coping modes are forms of schema also. Why? They're mental patterns, and they attach to the mental pattern of our deep disappointment, producing the complex. Okay, so we need to use the term schema. We divide the schema of the emotional wound, for example, deprivation, abuse, abandonment, subjugation, and these emotional wounds, but punitiveness can be a function as a coping mode and as a schema, because we can be in a culture of punitiveness. That's, in other words, all we know. And, well, we see that certainly in the world culture, the conception of hell, for example, is a punitive-oriented conceptualization. Get that idea? And so we realize that these coping modes can operate culturally also. They can be culturally sanctioned and become somewhat more problematic when that occurs. Yes, enlightenment and the liberation from these misguided cultural norms requires you to be yourself. You're going to need to be yourself. We're going to have to break the spell of our culture by degree, otherwise we can't review the values of our culture because they are too internalized, and we can do it, however. So being judgmental, very common. Being judgmental now, that can also be being entitled. So you may have a relationship with being entitled. If I get what I want, I'm okay. If I don't get what I want, I'm not okay. That can be on many different levels. And it can be a maladjusted coping mode that repeats. That's how you know you have a schema, an early maladjusted schema. It's repetition. It's happening again. So entitlement, and these are apparently unflattering coping modes. However, they are also normal. They are excessive. That is what happens when entitlement becomes maladjusted. It becomes excessive. We also are interested in the maladjusted coping mode fixing others as it relates to this. Fixing others is a maladjusted coping mode in which we take the focus off ourselves and we begin to talk and judge others. Very often we'll have a party, we're together with our spouse, and as soon as the party leaves, we begin to talk about their problems. And sometimes it's okay, very often it is a maladjusted coping mode. We are practicing being judgmental to the point of believing that we do not have the quality that we're talking about. In other words, if somebody is particularly jealous, for example, or envious, we may begin to talk about that, and in the idea that we do not suffer from envy itself, and that is what produces the intrusive shadow effect. It's a denial effect. So compensatory coping modes like being judgmental, being entitled, fixing others can produce a shadow effect. The shadow effect is a denial of an aspect of ourself that cannot be denied, and that aspect of ourself then uninvitedly intrudes into the body of our affairs. So give some thoughts to these maladjusted coping modes. It's critical that we be practicing non-judgmental attention, because otherwise we decide we shouldn't have a maladjusted coping mode. Get that idea? We have to understand we're in the human condition, and we need to accept every card in the deck and understand that it is potential and not take it personally or too personally. This is why we meditate. Let's do it now. We're going to meditate. We're going to suspend judgment now. We're going to, if you can identify with being judgmental, fixing others, being entitled, I'd like you to recognize that you're going to suspend doing that. So let's just move into the meditative placement of attention. Let us think about these maladjusted coping modes that we just reviewed. Understand that they are a part of our life. We do it. We are interested in not overdoing it. And in that interest, we completely suspend practicing it. And we're going to, right now, we're going to utilize mindful exposure to well-being, because we're going to turn over the tendency to be judgmental towards others, to be entitled, to want to fix others. We are allowing these qualities to exist within the domain of existence, and yet we're divinely indifferent, focusing on the breath. Let's come to our senses, take our mind off the video, listen to your environment, truly be yourself. And let's debrief. Now, that's how it's done. We're going to do it with more maladjusted coping modes. They will need to be interrupted throughout the day. That means that you need to ID your maladjusted coping modes. You need to identify it and your relationship to it, that which possessed you, that which provided for your overcompensations, and needs to be reduced. I reduced my maladjusted coping mode, which was looking good and being impressive. It is its opposite. And you can see that being entitled, when you look at it being its opposite, you see its deprivation. Fixing others is the refusal to look at yourself, and being judgmental is a denial of your nature. How wonderful, huh? How wonderful. We swallow the pill of being alive. We suspend judgment. The entire universe is off the hook. Wow. By the way, this does not leave us in a psychotic condition, quite the contrary. These are not, over compensations. We do not seek to be fair to the point of it being an overcompensation. In other words, we relax. And in the spirit of Popeye, I am what I am, and that's all that I am. I am Popeye the Sailor Man. We enter our authentic condition, trusting that as we let our intellect off the hook off the hook of these maladjusted coping modes, it will roam into other domains, enriching our lives and providing us the wonderful blessings of existing. Well, thank you for your participation. We're going to go on with the next lecture, and we're going to be looking at the compensatory coping mode of being innocent, being outstanding, being someone else, being impressive, a very important fear-based, anxiety-based, maladjusted coping mode. Thanks for tuning in.